Welcome to Healthcare du Jour, where we dish up and digest the latest in healthcare. For the next 30 minutes, sit back as we bring you insight, commentary, and discussion on trending topics to the table, all expertly served up by our host and his guests. Healthcare du Jour is brought to you by High Tech Answers and Healthcare Now Radio, part of the Answers Media Network, and is sponsored by the law offices of Myrick O'Connell. Now here is your host, Matt Fisher.
Well, welcome back, and thank you for joining as we dive into the hottest topics in healthcare. I'm your host, Matt Fisher. On the menu today is our first ever returning guest, Lucia Savage. Welcome back.
I'm thrilled to be back one more time, Matt.
Yeah, no, it's great to have you on. I'm sure we're going to have a very fast-paced conversation just like last time. So just in case someone out there listening is not familiar with you, would you mind giving everyone a little bit of background about who you are and what you do?
Sure. I'm the Chief Privacy Officer at the Office of the National Coordinator for Health IT, and I have a team of about 12 professionals who handle advising the Secretary and the National Coordinator on health IT security and privacy in all their forms.
All right, well, great. So I think that will be a nice little setup for our focus today, which will be cybersecurity, which I know is a very important topic for you. So, you know, overall, how do you feel healthcare is doing when it comes to cybersecurity?
I think it's doing better. I think the awareness of the need to bring more cybersecurity, more engineering, more human behavior, more training into healthcare relative to security is really growing, and that's all to the good. I think that more work needs to be done in terms of helping healthcare catch up to other sectors in the maturities with which they engineer for privacy, and also in how they train their staff.
Right. Kind of picking up on the training, I agree with you. That certainly seems like a big one, and I'd argue it's driven by regulatory requirements as you kind of dive into some of the surrounding regulatory framework. So what do you see as the best strategies to be able to get that training enhanced?
Well, I'll take a step back from that and say that the whole of the federal government has really been driving an approach that is less compliance and checklist-based than sort of risk management-based, and I think that that should be the informative thread in your training. How do you get your workforce to identify and avoid risks before they happen? And it could be as simple as, training exercises related to phishing emails, as well as training on how to do password management. There's all kinds of pieces to that. But I think underneath that, or maybe even more overarching, is that the whole problem is really a human behavior problem, right? The people who take advantage of security vulnerabilities are acting badly and potentially criminally, and people who don't identify the risks and avoid them could use better training in their behavior to make that happen. So it all kind of comes down to human behavior.
Right. I like how you framed it, that we should be focusing more on risk management, which sounds like an active process as opposed to kind of a check-the-box type compliance method.
I think that's right. It's both intended to be active and thoughtful, but also to be iterative, right? You're constantly checking, or at appropriate periods checking your risks. Just like you might, set up software to remind you when to step away from your computer and rest your hands. You need to have systems in place to step back, look at the security of your controls, and evaluate if they're still working properly.
Right. No, as I said, I think that is a great point, because it's really a holistic approach, and it's not trying to focus on one particular piece. And then I'd like to take up another thread that you mentioned, which is that these efforts are really a focus of the government as a whole, as opposed to thinking it's just a healthcare issue. So could you kind of tease that out a little bit?
Sure. Well, of course, it's been in the news. Cybersecurity has been in the news a lot. And without getting into political hacking, I think the two key components of that to really keep in mind is that healthcare, being 1/6 of the economy, is really important for the overall cybersecurity approach of the government. And here within the government, there's a lot of internal coordination that goes on that people may or may not be aware of, but the Health and Human Services connect across agencies and across stakeholders within healthcare and public health, and that in turn is connected to the national security infrastructure through the Director of National Intelligence, Homeland Security, the FBI, And I won't say it's an all hands on deck because that implies that it's a crisis, and I won't say that, but I will say it's everyone's involved in this. And I want to kind of call your listeners' attention to two recent trans-federal or things that are happening across the government that I think are really important and informative for healthcare in particular, but also show how healthcare is a piece of the rest of the economy. So December 1st, the President's Commission on Improving Cybersecurity Infrastructure issued a report, and I said at the Federal Advisory Committee this week that people should read it just because it's one of the best written federal reports I've ever read. But more importantly, it really looks at the economy-wide and what are things that we as a nation can be doing to improve our cybersecurity response. And it does a very good job of categorizing items that would be for private sector collaboration, for public-private collaboration, and for the government alone. And it's a great read. The other thing it does a really good job of is helping people understand that as all information has become digital, and literally this is everything from digital health records to if you have a Nest or some kind of digital thermometer that feeds to your home, that information as well, how the Internet of Things has really rendered the concept of economic sector much less relevant, and that looking at securing digital information is important for all sectors and all people within the nation. So great read. And then, of course, a month after that, on Friday, the 30th of December, the FBI and Homeland Security did, I won't say unprecedented, but certainly uncommon, a nationwide, open, public, no clearance required teleconference on cybersecurity and the state of cybersecurity. But the key takeaway from that, and again, I list these in my Federal Advisory Committee presentation on healthit.gov, is they listed actually some engineering techniques and human behavior training techniques that I think is a great 8-part checklist for stakeholders, particularly who have less sophistication, to use to say, oh, am I doing that? The FBI and the Director of National Intelligence and Homeland Security are recommending that I uptake that technique.
Right, so maybe if you would like, we can dive into each of those kind of reports separately so that we can kind of give some key takeaways. So let's take the President's Commission first, just one, you mentioned it first, and it published first. So what do you see as the key takeaways out of that report? Understanding that that might be hard to tease apart given the overarching message of it, which is, we all need to be doing a better job, and we need to be improving our systems as we've been talking about.
Well, it's a complicated report. It has 16 overarching recommendations, and there are subparts within that, so it's going to be impossible to tease that apart in the time we have today. I think the genesis of the report is important. President Obama commissioned the report in late 2015 and intended it to be a document for the new president, not President-elect Trump, but whichever president was elected, so that they would have a very good, not only look at, but roadmap for improving cybersecurity across the economy in recognition of the fact that, this is a kind of a threat domain we really didn't envision 10 years ago. And so that's an important thing. I think it hits that intention, which is to create an overarching thematic document that helps stakeholders, for example, in traditional internet companies who are now developing health businesses, and traditional health businesses that are now developing internet companies, to figure out how they meet and collaborate together to improve the security of the digital health.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. It's nice to see something like that that's forward-looking, given that in between, as you said, the time when it was commissioned to occur and then when the report was actually issued, we keep having the development of the Internet of Things, which you referenced, and then also that attack on DIN in the fall that, especially in being in the Northeast, I noticed it and I was wondering, why is my Internet not working so well? And then,
that's right. What happened to Twitter today? The other thing I would say about that is it does a really nice job of separating who's capable of doing what. So it really has, so for example, it has a section about regulation, and it calls out the capabilities of the government to both influence what happens in the way that the government procures and requires systems for the business it's doing as government, or regulations for authorities that require regulations, compared to what people can do in the private sector, like improve their employee training programs, knowledgeable people support and mentor people who need knowledge, and engineering in the private sector to make digital information better protected.
Right. That really just goes to highlight how everything is interconnected. You know, as you were saying, you can't say this is just a healthcare issue or just a financial issue. It's really kind of the world issue, since all the boundaries are kind of disappearing.
That's right, and Matt, this will have to be for a conversation another time, but I have had the good fortune to participate in conversations with other people, policymakers in other countries, and this issue of Internet of Things and cybersecurity, particularly as it relates to large-scale hacking efforts, whether it's by nation states or by large criminal enterprises, it is a worldwide concern.
Yeah, no, I agree. That would be a topic for another time, because it's so hard. It's so hard to keep narrowing it down.
Right.
But you know, now kind of turning to that second piece that you mentioned, which was the joint Homeland Security and FBI cybersecurity briefing. Would you be able to just quickly summarize the 8 steps that you had briefly mentioned?
I'm going to try to pull them up right now on my PowerPoint if I don't mess up entirely what my screen looks like. So give me a second. Should be them. Sure, they recommend data backups at different locations. Obviously, a regular risk analysis and remediation. We talked about a risk-based approach. Staff training is item number 3. Item 4 is vulnerability scanning and patching your software, which is different than what I'm going to talk about at the end. Application whitelisting, so these are known to be good applications, and maybe identifying applications that are not so secure or that are engineered in insecure environments. And I know the Director of National Intelligence has some programs on software supply chain. Incident response, which is how an organization responds to a security incident and what they do about it. Obviously, business continuity planning, you've got to have a backup, and then you have to have a plan for executing on that data backup if your source data is compromised. And lastly, penetration testing, which we've been doing a lot of thinking about here at ONC relative to improving the rate of ethical hacking and penetration testing by third parties in healthcare.
Right. Yeah. No. The penetration testing issue is an interesting one. I've been meeting more and more vendors who are doing it as well, and it really seems like it's becoming an essential service if you're going to try and be able to do a comprehensive risk analysis of your system.
Well, you know, I try to explain this stuff to people who don't do it for a living. I always try to come up with an analogy, particularly when I'm talking to lawyers, that resonates with people who don't do technology. And it's sort of like hiring a professional editor, right? You might be a very competent writer, but at the end of the day, that professional editor is going to find the typos and find the grammatical errors that you will have missed because you're thinking about what you intended to say, not what you put on the page. And the penetration testing and bringing in a third party person to check the security controls in your organization can really be beneficial to help identify things you overlooked, not because you were negligent, but because you just weren't thinking about it.
Right.
Because
yeah.
It's familiar to you and you skipped over it.
Right. You know, as you said, I certainly get that experience when I'm writing documents. You read it and your brain sees what you expect should be there as opposed to what might actually be there.
Exactly, exactly. Or, you know, sometimes in the case of security, you fix one thing, but it causes something else in the system, and you have to constantly check. But yeah, we know there's a lot of thinking being done about this in healthcare. The FDA, of course, had ethical hacking as a big topic at its device workshop a year ago, and we know the DoD is looking at ethical hacking for its non-secret systems so that it can sort of improve the security of its periphery. And so it's a great thing if you're doing it properly.
Yeah, no, I mean, to some degree, it's almost kind of like crowdsourcing. You know, obviously selective crowdsourcing, but you're relying on other people to take a second look and hopefully finding people that are either going to take a different angle than you would, or what I always like to do is find people who are smarter than I am, and then that I can learn from.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely taking advantage of external expertise. I'm not sure I would agree about crowdsourcing because I think you really want to have a hacker or somebody who's doing this who's really ethical, who's going to, be respectful of your intellectual property, your business positioning. In the case of healthcare, of the needs to treat PHI in a very specific way under particular rules. So, this is kind of rocket science, right? Not just anybody can do this, which doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. It means you should do it thoughtfully and with professionals.
Right. Yeah, and going to the other elements that you listed, as you were kind of summarizing them, a lot of them should be familiar to the people who are in healthcare, because it's, I think, having a backup plan, doing a risk analysis, a lot of those things are elements that are required under HIPAA or, some of the other schemes that healthcare hopefully knows very well.
Well, I think that's true, but I think that, we are always trying to look out for the little healthcare providers. So I think it's important to distinguish here between really large organizations that may have systematically executed on all of these and more, and small organizations that may not know the difference between vulnerability scanning and penetration testing, even if they could afford to hire somebody to do either one of those things, or whose staffs are really small and pressed for time, and security training is not something they have to regularly undergo. So there's a lot of, because healthcare is so economically diverse, it's really important to think about all 8 of these things in the context of the entire healthcare system, everything from a rural hospital and a federally qualified health center with a predominantly non-English speaking staff to the really gigantic multi-state organization that might be publicly traded.
Right. So, I definitely agree with you in terms of the challenges that the smaller or, maybe arguably less sophisticated providers may have. So do you have any thoughts in terms of how to be able to kind of bridge that gap, or?
Sure. Well, we have a special portfolio, or we look at our security portfolio in that special light, and so we are always at ONC trying to create tools and information that really help these small to medium-sized practices. The #1 download at healthit.gov is our security risk assessment tool, because of course eligible providers under the Meaningful Use program are required to attest that they've done a risk assessment, and we've created a public open source tool that helps them do that. We have our privacy and security guide. We have security training videos. Our new contracting guide has a whole sections on it about thinking about security when you buy your EHR, so that you are having the right conversation with your developer, and the developer, who is really the expert engineer, is providing as much security support as you think is right for your business. So those are examples of what we have done at ONC to really help support this particular part of the healthcare economy.
Yeah, no, I think those are good references, because as you said, there has been a lot coming out from both ONC and I think OCR to help guide people and give insights that had been missing, and to make that information readily available to everybody.
That is correct, and we're always driving more, but I will say we're a government agency with an educational mission. We're not an advertising agency who knows healthcare, and so we're always looking for people like this podcast or other organizations to go, wow, look at this great tool that ONC did, and then help their membership have access to it. Everything is open source on healthit.gov, but we can only push it so far.
Right. So kind of picking up on that theme of what ONC has been doing to help, I would like to touch on another kind of initiative, which was the information sharing and analysis that
Sure.
kind of program that was, I think, what's first rolled out over the summer, and then the grants were awarded in the fall.
Well, so we've been planning this for a long time, and for any of your listeners who follow Dr. Mostashari on Twitter, he'll say, oh yeah, we first tried that in 2011. So we've been working on this for a really long time. We finally got to execute on our ambitions, which was to create a grant to an outside private nonprofit, which would then have a charge under the grant of facilitating more widespread threat sharing within the healthcare system. So we awarded our grant in September, and the agency within Health and Human Services, who actually is responsible for cybersecurity coordination, which is mouthful now, Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response, they also awarded a grant on the same day. The grantee is National Health ISAC, and they will be, from our grant, doing 2 or 3 things. I don't have them all memorized. It's available on our blog. But they are supposed to create systems by communication paths by which threat sharing received from HHS and the national security infrastructure can then be shared out more widely in the healthcare system at a low cost to the recipient of the information. And secondly, to create educational and support mechanisms so that people who receive those threats know what to do once they've received them. Because that's the other piece of feedback we get is, great, you're telling me about ransomware, but what do I do now?
Right, which is kind of a common theme that people who follow the health IT or big data within healthcare is great. I've got all this information, but what do I actually do with it now that it's in my hands? Because you have to tell me, you have to help me analyze it. I don't have the time to sift through all of it.
It's actually, you're right, exactly right. It's another version of the signal to noise ratio problem.
Yeah. So talking about that threat sharing, kind of I think circles back to what we were talking about, which was these cybersecurity issues aren't just unique to one entity or one industry. It is really bleeding across different areas. So to the extent that people can share the information, what do you see as the benefits, both I guess immediate and long term?
Well, I've talked about this a lot, but I sort of see it like a neighborhood watch, but in a virtual way. And I want to preface this for listeners by saying that what we're talking about is sharing a threat you observe in your system. We're not talking about sharing information about patients. That's a completely different topic. This is sharing a threat you see in your system. And a great analogy, a neighborhood watch is a great analogy because it works like this. You're in your healthcare neighborhood. You know exactly which cars belong on your street. You know generally who goes in and out of the building because they're supposed to, or in and out of the house because you're supposed to. And your job as a good neighbor is to tell your other neighbors, hey, there was a car driving up and down the street. It looked like it was casing people's places. Or, somebody was using a crowbar on your door the other day and I called the police. So that's identifying neighborhood threats to your neighbors. And we want people to do that in healthcare. I found this malicious software and it looked like this on my system, and now you know what to look for on your system.
Right. Because as you're saying, not everyone's going to catch everything. So if we can create a common pool of knowledge, we're more likely to at least get even with these individuals or other actors who are perpetrating the attacks.
Correct. And we also know that a lot of times people find the malice many months after it's actually started to work on their system, and we hope that by threat sharing we can start fighting those malicious things faster.
Right. And would you see kind of an outgrowth or an outcome from the threat sharing, the ability to create tools to defeat the ransomware, the malware? Because I've seen reports recently of, there are these decrypting tools, so it's that are being shared on an open source basis that basically render certain, I guess, variants of ransomware ineffective now because there's that common knowledge of how to unlock it. But do you think that would be an outgrowth from the threat sharing?
I'm not enough of an engineer to really be able to answer that. I would presume that, what the engineers do tell me is that they're really, really good at their jobs, but the bad guys are often one step ahead of them. And so we just have to recognize, and I think that's circling us back to the beginning, part of the comments in the President's Commission report, which is we have to be better, but we have to know we'll never be perfect. Yes,
no, I think that's a great point. We're never going to know everything, but if we can do as good a job as we can, then we're doing what we can, what's possible.
Correct.
So I'd like to, in the last few minutes that we have, bring up kind of another topic that we had been talking about before as we were planning for the show, which was you had mentioned the Nist privacy engineering white paper.
Oh, sure. My other favorite update recently. So this actually just came out last week from Nist, and it is NA. Let me just see if I can get the title for you. You can get it on their website, but it's Nist IR 8062. So what this is a document that actually they started working on it in 2014 and they just finished it. It's designed as an introductory document to this concept that I've talked about privacy engineering. So it does a couple of things. It helps create an engineering language for helping systems attain privacy outcomes. The instigation was wanting federal agencies to be able to really comply with the new concepts in the revised Circular A130, and that's specific to the federal government. But the concepts behind Circular A130 are the same concepts behind HIPAA and Gramm-Leach-Bliley and all the other privacy rules. And so this document does a really great job of some ideas. I'm going to get my notes. So you know how we have in security, we think about availability, confidentiality, and integrity of data. So in this document, for example, there's a sort of a parallel rubric set out for what are the privacy outcomes we're trying to achieve in data, and they are predictability, the predictability of how it's going to be used, the manageability, making sure that it can be used in a manageable way, and the dissociability of data, which requires a little bit of drill down. So what that means is, what are the engineering ways in which we can dissociate identities from data and still have the data be meaningful? In HIPAA, we kind of think about de-identification, and we know we have our particular regulation, but that regulation also was first enacted when we didn't have the same capability of data combination that we have now. So it's important when we de-identify something to figure out if it's going to stay de-identified as it gets used. And dissociability is the concept within this paper about how do you ensure that where you don't need identity, you've dissociated the identity from the data itself that you're really trying to analyze.
Right. So when you're thinking about the privacy engineering from, in that perspective, how do you see the wraparound to security? Because in my mind, I'm picturing that if you can enhance, the protection around it in terms of who's it sounds like who's accessing it, how it gets utilized, that would in turn benefit enhanced security, or at least bring around some type of benefit there.
Well, so that's an interesting question, Matt. So we long have been advocates here of sort of moving away from what we call the M&M approach to security, where you have the tough exterior and an unspecified interior, and using engineering techniques to really make the interior more strong. So that could be what we call data segmentation, which is segmenting data into the subparts that you might need to use, which is kind of correlates to dissociability. And then it's not really a security technique, it's a privacy engineering technique. Another example would be, we have role-based access, which is a requirement under HIPAA, but we not only, that's access to the system, but now we need to engineer for what is monitoring, what is that role doing with the data that they now have access to. So that's sort of the predictability of how it's going to be used. And so that's one of the reasons I really like this Nist white paper, is it gives us some language to talk about the next step, how to move beyond that a hard exterior and into an engineered interior. And this is a great thing for Americans to really look at, because already privacy by design, which might well be called privacy engineering, is required in the EU.
Yeah, no, I think that is a great way to bring it around to the one of the points we were talking about at the beginning, which is, we have to be evolving, and we have to be thinking well beyond compliance. We have to be thinking about how to really build these concepts, whether it's security or privacy or any extension thereof, into the actual design of the industry and the design of systems, because it's nothing is simple in this world anymore.
Correct, and I don't know how much time we have left, but what I would say is, we know that people are generally altruistic and understand that data about them is helpful for research and learning and advancing science. They just don't want their private information to be compromised, and they don't want to have ill effects from having been altruistic. And it's privacy by design and privacy engineering that helps us take advantage of the learning, that the information the data can supply to us for learning, while at the same time accomplishing these really important goals for human dignity.
Yeah, well, on that hopeful note, I believe it or not, we are out of time. So I'd really like to thank you, Lucia, for appearing again and for engaging in such a great discussion. We'll definitely have to have you back in the future as things keep evolving.
Well, thank you for having me, Matt, and I hope that all of these agencies with these reports get 1,000 hits when you release this podcast, because these documents I've been talking about are really important.
Yes, no, I was looking at them, and I agree. Everyone should check them out, but I'd also like to thank everyone for listening. Keep the dialogue going and connect with me at #HCDEJURE. Until next time, I'm Matt Fisher.